Hello and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Claire Nazir. In this show, we're taking a look at how our changing climate is impacting nature with award-winning author Sophie Pavelle. Sophie Pavelle is a Devon-based award-winning author and science communicator. In her first book, Forget Me Not, Sophie embarked on a low-carbon journey around the UK in search of 10 animals and habitats threatened by our changing climate. In her newly published second book, To Have or To Hold, she looks at symbiotic relationships and how these are developing due to climate change. Alex Burkill caught up with Sophie for a chat about her findings.
Thanks very much, Claire. Now, Sophie, welcome back to the Met Office. It's so great to have you here again. Before we get into the books, what set you on the path to become a science communicator?
I came to science communication through a very roundabout way after having a million different work experience placements and everything from the military to environmental law to physiotherapy to like journalism, farming, everything, you name it, I did it. All in the name of finding out what I was good at. But I did zoology at university, which gave me a really good foundation understanding of nature and the planet. And then I came across and just late night researched this master's in science communication, and I had no idea what that was. But the more I read about it, it's a job that you're basically the middle person between academia and the public. And I see it as a role that is effectively like being a translator, where you're translating science.
Yeah.
Into stories and actions that the public can understand and feel galvanised by. So I did this master's, and it kind of set me on a path of storytelling, and so it kind of built from there in a portfolio sort of way where you experiment with stuff, and science on podcasts, science on telly, writing scripts, translating scientific papers, that sort of thing, doing shows or museum stuff, you know, like the exhibition. Information boards are actually really hard to write, but
I bet, but
important.
And you do lots of different things. It's all quite varied.
Yeah, it's so varied, and I think it's definitely a really growing, exciting field to be in, and it's a really important time to be having as many people in the field as possible, sharing their perspective on what's going on.
Now, you've written 2 amazing books focusing on nature and wildlife. What drove you to doing this?
The motivations for both Forget Me Not and To Have or To Hold were kind of varied. So with Forget Me Not...
Your first book?
First book, yeah, published in 2022 now, which feels crazy. It's 2 years ago. The main driver was that I felt like there was a gap in literature, particularly narrative non-fiction, for millennial age groups, so people in their 20s and 30s who are environmentally engaged, politically engaged, kind of all fired up to do something with their careers and with the world and to help the planet maybe, but need a little bit of a steer, and I fell into that category. And I felt like there was a lot of nature literature and about the climate and things for kids, and a lot of opportunity and resources for people in their sort of middle age of 30s and 40s, but I felt like I certainly wasn't finding stuff that really resonated with me at that point in my life. And at the same time, we were hearing all sorts of things going on about nature, especially in the British Isles. Like at that time, it was 1 in 7 species were at risk of extinction.
Has that now changed?
It's now 1 in 6.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, so it's got a little
going
bit
in the
worse.
wrong direction.
Exactly. So there just felt this growing urgency to tell stories that were maybe at risk of being overlooked in the British Isles about species that we may never have even heard about, I had never even heard about, each of which told a story of climate change in their own way. And so that was the main driver for Forget Me Not, as like a kind of haphazard but urgent introduction to species that are in need of our attention, written in a way that was perhaps a bit of a modern, fresh take on nature writing.
Sure.
And then 3 years on, with To Have or To Hold, my focus was a bit deeper. I wanted the conversation around nature and the climate and our connection to nature to be centred around a specific topic, which in this case was symbiosis.
Which is quite a specific topic. It's not something many people give much thought, I suppose.
No, so I think symbiosis, we've all heard the word. It's kind of culturally known in a loose sense. I think a lot of people associate it with like mutualism and equality and things living together or having some sort of relationship with each other. But in nature, it's a bit more complicated. In fact, a lot more complicated and very nuanced. But again, when I even started to research it as a topic, I realised that it wasn't really well known or well documented outside of children's literature and then academic literature. And I only started to research some specific symbiotic relationships to realise that this is just like a wealth of storytelling material. And I just got really excited because I was like, actually, this is a huge arm of evolutionary biology that brings in climate, biodiversity, human connection to nature, relationships between species that feels really important to be spotlighting right now at a time when I feel our relationship with nature is a bit turbulent.
Definitely, and there are, well, we'll come on to it, but there are things that maybe we could be doing to aid that. There's a strong climate aspect to both the books. Why personally is that important to you?
I think it was inescapable. I think I couldn't not have climate be the underlying narrative throughout both stories because it's pervasive to every single story that I profile in the books. It was pervasive in every conversation I had with academics and naturalists and researchers. The climate is integral to the past, present and future of many of these species that I talk about, and so it was kind of the inescapable truth, and which made it both enjoyable but also much more challenging to be able to weave in that story because there's so much we don't know and there's so many unknowns, and it's a picture that's changing all the time, as you know. So yeah, it was a non-negotiable part of the books.
Were there any major surprises? What were your biggest discoveries when you were researching your books?
I think one of the biggest discoveries was just how complicated climate change is, but also kind of how beautiful it can be. So it's not all doom and gloom. For some species, climate change can be bad news and be almost the thing that pushes them off the edge. Some of these species are totally on the brink. But for other species, like the grey long-eared bat, it can actually open up opportunities that those species hadn't had for years and open up new habitat through rising temperatures, for example, pushing them out of the even hotter parts of the Mediterranean back towards British shores, which previously weren't as hospitable and had made them almost extinct as a native species of mammal in this country. And then in To Have or to Hold, the biggest surprise to me was that it ended up being a book mainly about parasites, which I wasn't expecting when I came into this project understanding symbiosis as this kind of cosy mutual species living together, benefiting from one another and the interaction. But very quickly through research and through speaking to academics and understanding a little bit more, there's a much darker side to symbiosis, which is basically where suffering of species enables long-term survival and ecosystem balance. And so that became a huge part of the way that I tell these stories, is through the lens of this inequality, but somehow nature has found sustainability and balance, which is now up for in question again because of climate change.
So that's obviously quite a difficult route to go down,
Yeah.
because you're touching on something which you weren't expecting in terms of how kind of the brutal side of things and the brutal side of nature. And nature is brutal, and we know that. But were there other challenges? What were the hardest bits when it came to, well, obviously, I mean, with your first book, you were travelling around keeping things sustainable as possible. I guess that was quite challenging, especially post-COVID.
Yeah, totally. So for both books, actually, I did travel around the British Isles, and I tried to do so as much as possible by low carbon means, because I like a challenge, and I was also on a very small budget, and I wanted to use it as an opportunity to investigate how accessible are these habitats around the British Isles on a budget by public transport or by bike. And it turns out very challenging.
Yeah.
So for Forget Me Not, I did the classic trains, buses, biking, ferries, the lot, but it was during COVID, which was difficult. For To Have or to Hold, I tried it again. I was able to go further afield because we weren't in a pandemic. So I was able to visit places that I had wanted to for Forget Me Not, but I hadn't been able to access. So Ireland, the Channel Islands. So I tried to get as best a picture I could of what's going on symbiotically with the British Isles at the moment. But with To Have or to Hold, the massive challenge was that the number of extreme weather storms and named storms that I was travelling through. Nearly every single trip was accompanied by a named storm. And that became challenging, but also a story in itself, because it allowed me to reflect on it and think, well, actually, what is going on here, and why are we having so many storms and such exceptional weather throughout a whole calendar year, when I would expect them only to happen in the sort of storm season, not throughout the summer and spring and everything. So that allowed me again to interrogate climate change in a way that I wasn't expecting, and to be able to really let loose on the narrative and storytelling of, well, what is the future of these species living in these very complicated entwined relationships when they've got storms barreling through at 100 miles an hour. Will it literally physically rip them apart? Can they find each other again? So that became a really interesting point of view that I, again, wasn't really expecting to be going into quite as much.
Yeah, I did want to apologise for all the storms that affected
Yeah,
things.
I wanted to have a chat with you about it.
Yeah, not only with your book, but also your wedding was affected by Storm Anthony, wasn't it?
Yes, Storm Anthony was at my wedding.
So you've had some pretty bad luck with storms. Now, going through To Have or To Hold, and it talks about the symbiotic relationship. Is there anything from your research that you think we can draw from nature which can relate to our relationship with the environment, which, as you say, it's a delicate one?
Yeah, so from day one with To Have or To Hold, I wanted it to be a book about relationships. It's about nature's hidden relationships, but it's also about our relationships and between one another, and also our relationship with the planet. And the title itself is a play on the very well-known marriage vow, to have and to hold, and it kind of allowed me to use and play on that metaphor of our promise to nature, our long-term relationship goals with the natural world. And what I found is, yes, I was very surprised to be writing so much about parasites, which is the dominant form of symbiosis. Over 50% of all animal life relies on parasitism to survive. But within that, the survival of one species is counting on the suffering of another. And so in that, nature is beautiful but brutal, as you said, and violent. But the beauty of parasitism is that parasites don't want to kill their host. They need the host alive and almost thriving in order to take the resources they need to grow and feed and develop their own offspring and complete their own life cycles. A dead host would be a complete waste of energy and time. And so actually, if we're looking at our relationship with the natural world at the moment, there's actually a lot we can learn from parasites, because they've found balance and longevity over millions of years in this quite sustainable form of exploitation, where they take just what they need and they have that restraint almost in the resources that they're able to harvest from their host. And in many cases, the host, they might not feel amazing, but they can actually survive and live on and reproduce themselves after the parasite has done their dirty work. Whereas if we look at how we're going about our relationship with our host, the planet, we're almost being worse than a classic parasite, because we're taking and taking and taking and not giving back enough.
Taking too much.
Taking too much, we're over-exploiting, and if we sort of extrapolate that trend and carry on business as usual, we'll be in danger of, maybe harming our host so much that they can't recover, and then we'll be in a bit of a pickle ourselves, to put it lightly. So I think parasites can teach us how to live in more balance and just take what we need, and to exercise that restraint that I think we could be a lot better at.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that we do have this parasitic relationship with the world, but we need to make sure that we're not going to destroy it and tip it over the edge, which, if nature can do it, then we should. And
it's seeing parasites as not a bad thing either. I think culturally we have a real issue with the word parasite. We assume it as something that's, in the conservation sector, they've been shunned as invasive and associated with being disgusting and grotesque and something we want to ignore and forget about and not pay any attention to. But going back to that statistic of 50% of all animal life relies on parasitism for survival, that is an unbelievable wealth of life that we are ignoring or are in danger of ignoring. We ourselves host up to 400 species of parasite in our body at
which is a lovely thought, always.
Lovely thought. But I think the message that I'm trying to convey is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and to almost get over ourselves and to see parasites as having lessons that we can learn from, and balancing and regulating energy flow in ecosystems, and adding strength and resilience that is so important at the moment.
Were there any particular discoveries that hit you most profoundly when it comes to nature's interconnectedness?
Kind of lots. I think the fact that I went in again, assuming in a very sort of binary human way that these relationships would be comprised of two individuals. But nature's so complicated and it's never so simple. Often there's 3 or 4. Or like you can have, in lungwort lichen's case, the whole organism of lungwort lichen relies on a dynamic of 3 species living together until they part in death. Whereas in aspen, in the aspen bracket fungus chapter, where I'm in an aspen woodland in the Highlands, death and decay in a woodland is almost the gateway that opens up the symbiotic relationship that is relied upon by the fungus and a very rare species of hoverfly called the aspen hoverfly that only exists in that rotting bark of aspen by virtue of the bracket fungus. And so I think it's this dynamic and this kind of flux that it's never so simple as one species and another coming together. They might for a beat, but then they might part, someone else might come in. And so I think it's, again, just my mind was blown so many times throughout the process of speaking to these scientists, doing the research, going on these trips, writing the book, that it just reminded me how little we know and how much there is left to discover and how exciting that is and what an amazing opportunity it is to remind ourselves that everything is touching each other in some way, and we'd be wise to pay attention to that when we're trying to look after the planet.
And it's not just, well, there's the climate change aspect of things that humans are doing, but that's not the only part that's impacting wildlife around the UK, around the world, is it? There are other factors at play.
Yeah, totally. So when I was researching arguably the most like gross chapter of the hairworm, and that's your classic parasite that buries itself in the brains of its insect host and turns it into a zombie and makes it do things it doesn't want to do in order to survive and complete its life cycle. So I had to get something gross in there, just to really test you. But the hairworm brought up discussions of other threats, as you say, that we're placing on the natural world, like light pollution and noise pollution into leaching from urban environments into the natural environment. And the thing about the hairworm is that in order for its strategy to work as a parasite, it has evolved to rely on complete natural darkness in order to have celestial cues from like moonlight on the water to guide it back to water. All it wants to do is get back to water. And research is pointing to the fact that it's guided by moonlight reflecting off of river water to guide its insect host back to water. If, as in many places, the surrounding area is polluted with artificial light, its ability to navigate, and this goes across the board for so many species that rely on darkness and natural cues and celestial cues to navigate, find prey, find food, it's disrupted. And I think it's something like 80% of the global human population lives under artificially lit skies. Anything that isn't useful light spills over into oceans, forests, rivers, and is totally disruptive. And the same goes for sound pollution. So I think like 60% of Europeans live in a soundscape that is equivalent by decibels to constant rainfall.
Oh wow, just because there's this constant noise
Traffic,
of sorts.
Construction, dogs barking.
Talking and
yeah,
shouting,
literally
music.
you name it. Yeah, totally. If you go to London,
No, it's never quiet.
even if you're in Hyde Park, you think it's quiet, but there's a constant hum in the background.
Yeah.
And so that...
Even in most people's gardens, you
Totally.
can generally
Yeah, planes.
hear... Yeah.
And it was only in COVID, when we had all of that shut off, that we realised this spectacular silence. And the trouble with that is I think it's every 3 decibels of extra noise halves the distance for which natural sound can travel.
Oh, okay.
So if you've got a...
So if you rely on natural sound
if you
to travel and
yeah,
to
if
get
you need to
around.
call to a mate, or you're relying on hearing your prey, and that sound wave is interrupted by our sound. It's as simple as like a parasite can't locate their host. A parasitic stage might be lost from their life cycle. Again, if 50% of all animal life relies on parasitism to survive, that then jeopardizes a huge proportion of the food web, just by being in a loud, artificially lit environment. So climate change is one aspect of the way in which we as people are inflicting an impact on the world around us. And there are easy ways, in my opinion, that we can sort of reduce that simply by having a bit more awareness as to nature's rhythms and cycles and what they need, which is actually very fundamental, simple, basic requirements to just survive, and we would benefit from that as well.
And do you think we're going in the right direction in trying to counter the negative impacts that we're having?
I think it's very tempting to go down a very negative route and to say everything's rubbish, nothing's being done, the needles aren't moving. But the fact we're sat here having this conversation is a really positive thing, because this is going to speak to people, and people hopefully will listen and take things on board, or at least have a renewed awareness as to something they may not have thought about before. And I think that awareness is growing across the public domain and the public psyche. The more people I meet, the more conversations I'm having about people are waking up to the fact that we have an impact, but through that impact and interference, we have the power to restore and renew and take a new path. And so I genuinely think it's a question of communication and public engagement and education. And I think we're potentially at a really exciting turning point with that, with more tools and resources at our disposal to kind of take those narratives into our hand and use things like social media in a positive way. But ultimately, I do feel like there's stagnation in other levels of conservation and policy and legislation that is not matching the pace of public demand for change. But the more the public kind of ask for change and demonstrate change themselves, I think the more that might happen systemically. More research, hopefully, always.
More can be done, and more hopefully will be done, and the quicker it happens,
the better.
The better from lots of reasons point of view. Looking again at the climate change route, was there one particular moment on your journey which really stood out, really hit you?
I think it was when I was on a boat with a wildlife tour group looking for the ocean sunfish in Cornwall, and we were under sail, and we had everything pointing in our favour to see the largest bony fish in the world. And the tides were right, the conditions were right, the sun was out, it was calm, everything was looking great. And we were at the peak season, and this wildlife tour operator called Marine Discovery, Penzance, they're all qualified scientists on board. They harvest data from every single sail they do that feeds into national counts and biodiversity surveys and ocean research. They're an amazing team. And based on previous years and research, they were like, this is the window that we're going to see the ocean sunfish. And I was like, great, I'd love to see one. Perfect. Everything was aligning, the stars were aligning. And yet 4 days in a row, I went out with them. Every single day the conditions were perfect, didn't see a thing. And then the frustration and the kind of selfish frustration of I wanted to see a sunfish and I didn't get to see a sunfish turned into concern as to, well, what on earth was going on? And then we started to almost brainstorm, with the crew to sort of say, well, looking at the data, this is quite worrying. And we were seeing other things like lots of dolphins, and that's amazing, but it's not necessarily a good thing at that time of year. They should be elsewhere. And then Duncan, who was the skipper of the boat, who's a marine biologist himself, was hypothesising all sorts of things, but basically starting to correlate it to drought that was happening in the Mediterranean, and then realising that actually at the time of sailing, we were in the grips of a marine heat wave. Marine heat waves are not good news for species that rely on certain temperatures and timings to interact with other species, and so it started to feel sad and almost out of control, and I remember feeling quite anxious when I was chatting with him, because he was coming up with all these big questions, but there were no answers, and the fact that they seemed concerned, not just disappointed that we didn't see the sunfish, I think spoke of a much wider issue that was happening around the world's oceans, not just in that pocket of Cornwall.
Having spoken to marine scientists over the recent heat waves, there is a lot of uncertainty as to what they bring. And I think no one's in any doubt that it does impact the wildlife, but we just don't know yet how badly. I'm guessing when you spoke to these people, are they seeing an increased trend towards less often seeing the sunfish where they expect? Or
I think it's more unpredictability. I think over the years they had managed to identify patterns of movement, but with things like marine heat waves and terrestrial drought that were throwing things out of whack, I think suddenly they're finding that they can't predict as much, or the patterns are too erratic, and some fish might be suddenly cropping up in places that they've not been to for ages or never even been to before. And as ocean migrators who travel around the world's oceans, that's quite alarming, because that speaks to what's happening in a much more global view as opposed to like a regional view. But I think it's just that there's a lot of question marks, patterns are difficult to find, therefore more research is needed.
I think it's all connected, isn't it? In as much as, yes, the sunfish may go somewhere they've never been before, and they may thrive there, which is great for them. But there will be a knock-on effect, won't there? Both in their new environments, new habitats, and also where they've left and where they're no longer, because everything relies on this balance that we have at the moment. So changes are going to cause problems.
I think so. And then another thing that came from that conversation, and actually new research came out last week to confirm this, but in clownfish, is that marine heat waves, so I think it's this really alarming statistic that 90% of heat can plunge into the oceans and just remain there. And that doesn't only cause things like ocean acidification, coral bleaching, that sort of thing, but it's actually having the effect on the nutrients being available in the marine waters, to the point where it's making species physically smaller because they can't get as much nutrition to grow. So they found in this research last week that clownfish are actually shrinking in size. Wow. And this correlated with research. I was chatting with a professor, Angus Atkinson from Plymouth Marine Laboratory, who found that terrestrial drought in the Mediterranean is changing the nutrients that are flowing out into the oceans to the point where plankton and zooplankton are shrinking. And that is the base of the entire marine food chain. And so that feels like quite a tangible image for me as someone on land, and especially thinking about the ocean sunfish, which is one of the largest fish in the sea. If species is shrinking because of ocean heat waves, that feels really pertinent to investigate and again be aware of, and it's something I would never have associated with heat.
But it's not all bad news.
No.
You talked about coral. There are some positive findings recently.
Yeah, so there was actually some research that came from Florida that was motivated by the really devastating marine heat wave in 2023. And Florida has this really iconic species of coral called elkhorn coral that relies on, it's like the classic symbiosis where it relies on an algal partner to photosynthesize and make the food and allow the coral to survive. And they've discovered that there's a different species of algae that can partner effectively with elkhorn coral to make elkhorn coral that can tolerate water up to 2 degrees Celsius hotter than the more common algal partners that elkhorn coral has thrived with for millions of years. And so I think there's so much hope, because I think it just reminds us how elastic nature can be in the face of threat and danger and instability, that actually, and that this is not the only example at all of symbiotic relationships that can flux and change with depending on the conditions around them, but there's hope for them in responding to, I don't think marine heat waves are going to go anywhere anytime. I mean, you tell me, I don't think they're going to be going anywhere.
It doesn't look like it.
It doesn't look like they're going anywhere. So I think if there are opportunities to find solutions or to be inspired by nature's own solutions to warming waters, then there is hope for fundamental habitats like coral reefs in much warmer oceans.
What kind of thing do you think people could be keeping an eye out for, be aware of when looking at the impacts of climate change or changing world and nature?
I think it can be as like far-fetched as, you know, extreme weather and seeing extreme weather play out across the world in different countries, whether it's hurricanes or typhoons or anything like that, or severe drought and wildfire, right down to what's happening on our doorstep. So I think a really classic one is insects. And
yeah, you mentioned, am I right, in your book you said within the next 100 years there's a chance that insects could be extinct?
Yeah, well, I think that's the like statistic that is worst case scenario that is kind of bashed around in the media to sort of wake people up to the fact that insects are on a tightrope. And there's the classic anecdote of, you know, oh, I used to see more insects on my car windscreen.
For sure, yeah.
Now I see none. And that's a really tangible example of, you know, there's something happening in nature that...
Which you don't notice it until someone mentions
right,
it. But then
exactly.
you think, actually, yeah, when was the last time that I had a bug on my windscreen?
Yeah.
It was a while ago.
Yeah, exactly. So it's whether, you know, like last year, I remember hearing barely any birdsong in the garden and seeing barely any bees. This year, I've heard more birdsong and seen more bees and butterflies. And yet I don't think I've done anything differently in how I manage my very small garden. And so I think it's these swings and boom and bust nature of, you know, some years nature feels visible and more omnipresent. Other years it feels complete, like it's deserted us. So I think it's just noticing those little things. And then, you know, recently in May, it was so dry and so sunny, and that felt strange. And I think, you know, the rivers felt really low. And every day I would wake up, open the curtains, blue sky, wall-to-wall blue sky, like, where is the rain? And I felt like that almost became quite a bone-deep concern that is obviously instinctive as mammals ourselves. We rely on rain and growth for our crops and to feed ourselves and our families. And so that total absence of that in the month where we would, or would we normally expect loads of rain in May? Or
no, not really, but I think it's one of the driest months of the year statistically. But we expect more than we had through this season. And even from my own experiences, obviously every day I was coming on talking in a mainly positive way, saying, you know, we've got blue skies, warm sunny weather around today. But always at the back of my mind, there was the fact that I've said this many, many days now, and you know, gardeners, farmers, they all rely on water, rain, and so they were, like, you know, getting in touch saying we actually need lots of rain. And there is the continuing concern of, well, why is this happening? And there is a climate change element, no doubt, to it. When you just look at how warm our seasons are getting, the fact that 8 of the 10 warmest springs have all happened since the year 2000. So there's that trend, and there's that trend in both how warm it is, how sunny it is, and how dry it is. And so those are the concerns, which then has a knock-on effect on everything, which is just really worrying. Now, before we finish, I want to get deep. So in your, not that some of the questions have been pretty deep already, you say you often ask people, what are you afraid of? And so I want to pose it to you. What are you afraid of?
I am afraid of apathy.
Okay.
And of delay. And I think there being a trend of talking but not walking, if that makes sense.
It
so
does,
all the talk.
I think
no
a lot of
action.
people do that.
Yeah. I think lots of people say the right things. Lots of people demonstrate a really good understanding and a good grasp of fundamental topics like how to manage an environment, what an environment needs in order to thrive, how ecology works and our place in amongst all of that, and how policy could help with that and protect nature. But actually that being implemented and practiced and prioritised is a different ballgame, and I think one that I think it would be brilliant if the pace at which the environment is changing is matched by action for it, positive action. And I think I'm afraid of the public feeling fatigued by climate doom and gloom, which feels kind of everywhere. And so I consider it my job, I guess, as a science communicator to try and come in and disrupt that and uplift with tangible stories that are quite gritty and demonstrate the reality of what's going on, but also bring hope and help people feel that they definitely have a role and their voice really matters in this conversation. Yeah.
So I guess that I was going to ask, what was your big aim? What were you hoping to get from writing these books? And I suppose that's what you wanted people to take away from it.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we are totally in company with nature throughout our whole lives. We are occupied by hundreds of species. We are one of hundreds of millions of species across the world. And, nature shows us that by collaborating, even if it's through quite violent, dark means, their outcome is a lot better and more positive than they were just to go at it alone. And so I think, again, there's just so many ways that nature teaches us how to live better together, both with each other and then alongside the planet. So I find that very hopeful.
Do you have any advice for anyone who perhaps doesn't know how to get in touch with nature?
Yeah, how long have we got? I think in really urban centres, it can feel like nature's very far away, but there are organisations and charities that have been set up with the primary aim of feeding that gap. For example, the Wildlife Trusts has 40 different branches all across the country. Many of the most active branches actually are ones in urban centres. London Wildlife Trust, for example, has a huge range of opportunities to allow people in the most inner city parts of London to engage with its wetland projects, to volunteer on some of its nature reserves on the weekends or during the week, to go to talks and workshops by experts to help people learn about the amazing species that are on their doorstep and then beyond. So I think if I could give one piece of advice, it would be to connect to your local wildlife trust, because no doubt they will have opportunities for you to grab.
One last thing. You're a published author, and you do a lot of work to help promote work that's going on around the world to tackle climate change and how it's impacting nature. What are you most proud of?
Well, I guess at the moment, to be completely honest, I'm most proud of To Have or to Hold.
And that you should be.
I'm trying to get better at saying that, but it was nearly 3 years in the making, and I definitely, there's a whole village of people behind the book, scientists, naturalists, experts, and then obviously the publishing team. And I feel that it came together in the most collaborative sense. And I'm proud of the messages that it relays, and I just can't wait to share the stories that's inside, because they're ridiculous and hilarious and also really important, I think.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Me.
As I knew it would be, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Anyone who hasn't been able to read your books, I definitely recommend that you do so. And we'll stay in touch, because I know you've got lots of exciting things coming up in the future.
Thank you for having me.